Are increasing human numbers the biggest constraint in moving towards sustainability, as predicted by Malthus and Hardin? Or are there other variables that should also be taken into account? Here are some for you. Are all human beings on the planet able to access resources in an equitable fashion? Can innovation, for example the Green Revolution, where agricultural innovation helped increase yields, help reduce problems in society caused by limited resources? Do people in society cooperate, bargain, and collaborate with each other in order to avert the negative effects of our society on the environment? Considering that we live on a planet where resources are finite, does it make sense to focus attention on the way resources are consumed rather than just the number of people consuming resources? So if you look at this graphic, you'll see, for example, that 16% of the households in New Delhi consume 50% of the water supply. This lecture will explore how some thinkers have approached some of these troubling questions, particularly the ones posed by Malthus and Hardin. We live in an extremely inequitable world. This inequity prevents people from accessing resources that they need the most: food, water, healthcare, and education. The other side of this inequity coin is that some of us have exceptional access to all the four fundamental necessities that I just mentioned. Recent estimates of poverty in our country indicates that more than 600 million people in our country live in conditions of scarcity, and another 100 million who live in conditions of extreme poverty. All over the world and in India, people in poverty have fewer years of schooling and lower life expectancy than their richer counterparts. Is it enough to just divide the amount of resources and divide it by the number of people on the planet then? The reality is that many of us access and consume resources much more than others. Look at this Delhi water consumption pattern again. So a direct response to Malthus came from Esther Bosrup. Known for her work on agricultural innovation in India and other countries, Esther Bosrup predicted that societies would continue to innovate when faced with crisis, and that agricultural production would always match up or even grow faster than population. An example of this innovation is the Green Revolution in India, where farmers gained access to irrigation, high-yielding varieties of seeds, fertilizers and insecticides, and were able to increase the overall agricultural production in India over 2 to 3 decades. So if you look at the graph of agricultural yield versus population over time in India, you can make out this pattern. Per capita food availability has definitely increased. So Bosrup's predictions have largely turned out to be true for India. The population line and the food production line has a similar shape, if you notice, implying that food production is growing geometrically over time, similar to population. So this basically overturns Malthus's prediction that food production would only increase arithmetically. However, due to inequitable distribution, benefits of our higher agricultural production are not accruing equally to all of our citizens. So you can still see food pile up in godowns, and you can still see people who have very high malnutrition rates, or some who even starve to death. So the pattern I describe above, where numbers per se do not reflect the full story, and that equity and access are perhaps more important, was what Amartya Sen investigated in his studies of famine in Bengal in 1943. Sen is a Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist, and you might remember him as the creator of the Human Development Index. Going back to his work, he studied the Bengal famine, which killed at least 1.5 million people, and maybe even up to 4 million people, because the estimates vary, largely due to starvation and disease. The high prices of food, coupled with very high inflation in 1942 and 1943, meant that the poor simply could not afford to buy food. Speculation and hoarding caused prices of food to increase further. The response of the government was also insufficient, although this was not the first famine the area had experienced. So the Malthusian explanation of this crisis is a very straightforward one. Too many people, not enough food, leading to the death of millions of people. However, recent research findings by Sen reflect that equitable food distribution and timely intervention by the government could have been the crucial factor in preventing the loss of millions of lives. So innovation has definitely helped in avoiding the disaster that Malthus predicted from a finitude point of view. But as you will learn in later lectures, there were many negative aspects of the Green Revolution as well. But what about the problems posed by increasing human population in a fragile world? If you remember the previous lecture, this was the problem posed by Garrett Hardin. Work done by Elinor Ostrom helped revise this theory that a large number of human beings are bad for the fragility of the planet. Through her work, Ostrom showed that overuse and degradation is prevented by people who bargain, collaborate, and cooperate with each other. Many communities have an idea of working towards long-term sustainability, and rather than just prioritizing short-term gains that may be had at the expense of future sustainability. So to go back to our traffic example, wouldn't it be nice if people had the power to design a sustainable transport system? One that was based on public rather than private transportation, and one that makes road use more equitable. The population question cannot therefore be examined without focusing in a very specific way on finitude and consumption. I will use the example of urban transportation in Bangalore to illustrate what I mean. Road space in Bangalore is a finite resource. There is a large community of users of this resource, and the quality or functioning of this resource will be determined by equity of access. Like we discussed earlier, it makes sense from the environmental and social sustainability viewpoint for road space to be allocated for buses rather than cars. But the situation now is that probably 10% of the users who own cars occupy more than 80% of the road space that's available. So like the famine in Bengal, where the government response to the inequitable access of food was inadequate, current imagination of urban transportation only takes into account rich people who can afford to buy a car and ignores a large proportion of poor people who need to be mobile but have very few options for affordable transport. So what you get in real life today is crowded buses in a road choked with cars. So I hope by now that it is clear that merely looking at raw population numbers is a flawed way of approaching either ecological or social sustainability. I also hope that you understand how consumption of finite resources is something that needs more of our attention. In our next lecture, we will try and apply the concepts of equity, access, and distribution of resources that we have learned so far, and try to understand how these concepts influence fairness, fragility, and finitude.